Hello, and thanks for tuning in to Look Up, the new news and current affairs programme from 𝗟𝗶𝗴𝗏 Media. Every week I'm joined by my co-host and colleague, Pádraig Ó Maonlaí, and we're going to look at news stories that we believe either didn't get the coverage that they deserve in mainstream media, or on the other hand, were received quite biased and unfair coverage. Thanks for joining us again this evening, Pádraig.
Thanks very much, Finbar.
We've got a good lot lined up today, so we're going to get stuck in. But just before we do, there were a number, well, one clarification and one update from stories from last week. The first one is in relation to what I said last week about the Russian President Vladimir Putin, who I said last week did not say that Russia would initiate a nuclear attack in Ukraine or outside of Ukraine now or into the future. And I received a number of messages to suggest that he did say that, and a number of Twitter debates suggesting the same. So I have here the exact words of President Vladimir Putin in relation to the speech that he made and that was referred to by the media and by me last week. He says in it, "They have even resorted to the nuclear blackmail. I'm referring not only to the Western encouraged shelling of the 𝗟𝗏𝗏 nuclear power plant, which poses a threat of a nuclear disaster, but also to the statements made by some high-ranking representatives of the leading NATO countries on the possibility and admissibility of using weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, against Russia. I would like to remind those who make such statements regarding Russia that our country has different types of weapons as well, and some of them are more modern than the weapons NATO countries have. In the event of a threat to the territorial integrity of our country and to defend Russia and our people, we will certainly make use of all weapon systems available to us. This is not a bluff." So I think it's clear that if you were to look at the second paragraph on its own, the narrative of the mainstream media might appear correct. But the second paragraph is underpinned and linked very much to the first paragraph. As you can see, the line of the second paragraph linked directly to the previous paragraph. So we can clarify that President Putin of Russia did not say that they would initiate nuclear strikes, but rather that they would respond possibly in kind. But he could have also been referring to weapons that Russia have developed, like hypersonic weapons and thermobaric weapons as well. Pádraig, you have an update from a story from last week in relation to Irish neutrality.
Yeah, thanks, Finbar. So last week we spoke about the launch of the Irish neutrality campaign by a group of TDs, and I think we remarked at the time that it'd be nice to see some meat on the bones. What was actually happened in the interim there, since our last broadcast, was another ship has come into Cork Harbor, and this time it's from the Belgian origin. We spoke to 𝗟𝗏𝗏 𝗪𝗏 in Cork, who gave us an update on that.
Last week, myself and Pádraig Ó Maonlaí had a discussion about neutrality on the first episode of Look Up, our new news and current affairs programme on 𝗟𝗶𝗴𝗏 Media. Since that discussion, within a couple of days of that discussion, in fact, a military or a Navy ship came into Cork Harbor. It's not the first of its kind. There has been one person who's been particularly vociferous around the country about this issue of Navy ships coming to Ireland from different countries and often NATO countries, and that's 𝗟𝗏𝗏 𝗪𝗏 from County Cork. So 𝗟𝗏's joined us just to answer a couple of wee questions about what happened this weekend and what does he think is happening. There seems to be a pattern developing. 𝗟𝗏, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Finbar. Yeah, this is a crucial issue. I'm glad you're addressing it. What we had this past week in Cork is yet another NATO warship. It's from the Belgian Navy. No, it's not a big battleship, a small coastal defence ship, but nonetheless an armed NATO ship right into the centre of Cork City. And I think what it is like, this is the fourth now in just a few months, the fourth foreign military ship, and I think they're softening us up for the acceptance of militarism and of warships coming into the Cork Harbor here. I mean, like this boat couldn't have been closer to the city centre, somebody mentioned, unless they got a submarine to go under the bridges. It came right in, like bypassing even the naval base and other obvious stopovers if it was merely a casual port visit by a passing ship. So this is brought deliberately, I believe, into the public eye, and not just myself. You do me too much there, there's actually a campaign now, the campaign for Irish neutrality, and quite a few people, but we need a lot more, because war and our involvement in it is increasingly an issue. I know we're spending, as a state now, we're spending money which is helping Ukraine in its efforts. And through the European Union, our money is being spent on weapons to kill people. And this isn't our neutrality. I know outrageously, and it was left to pass, Simon Coveney, I think, redefined what neutrality meant there about 2 weeks ago. And he said, basically, it means we're neutral, which gives us the power to make a choice of who we will support and how we'll support them in any given conflict. So that's a completely turnabout concept of what is neutral. So I think, even if one was party to a military alliance, the contribution Ireland could possibly make is minimal. Whereas on a peace footing, to be advocates for peace, we have the ability to make an immense contribution worldwide. And don't forget, millions have died in wars, even in recent years. Like, this is not a small issue of ships coming into ports or going around. There are millions of lives at stake, and our name is on it, and our money is on it. So we should stop that. So we need to step up this neutrality and peace activity. I mean,
so that was 𝗟𝗏 from Cork, who is a very active activist in many areas, but particularly in relation to the continued militarization of the Irish Republic and Cork Harbor in particular. Getting stuck into the news stories of the week, one of the biggest stories has to be the Nord Stream 2 pipeline attacks. You can see European leaders blame Russian sabotage after Nord Stream explosion. That's from the Washington Post. So really only in the last 24 hours has the finger been strongly pointed by mainstream media and by Western governments at Russia. But the likelihood of Russia having actually carried out the attacks on the Nord Stream pipelines, Nord Stream 1 and 2, is really highly unlikely. They have absolutely no motivation to do it whatsoever. It is one of their main bargaining chips, one of their principal investments. There's just no reason whatsoever why Russia would do something like this. And so we have to ask, who is the most likely culprit? Personally, I would conclude that the United States, probably with the involvement of the UK and Poland, have been heavily involved, and the Danes could not have known, or elements of the Danish government or military could not have known about this. Here is a video of Victoria Nuland, who made a speech not long ago in relation to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline.
With regard to Nord Stream 2, we continue to have very strong and clear conversations with our German allies, and I want to be clear with you today. If Russia invades Ukraine, one way or another, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward.
That was Victoria Nuland promising that, according to the United States government, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward. The State Department itself also issued, according to Fox News, issued statements to that effect. State Department vows Nord Stream 2 will be a hunk of metal at the bottom of the ocean if Russia invades Ukraine. So that's coming from the State Department themselves. So I think there can be little doubt that the Nord Stream attacks were the result of US activities in that area. There's very little doubt. And it's left a situation where the likelihood of negotiations, the likelihood of a peace deal with Ukraine is less and less because of this. And the likelihood of Russia and Germany in particular suffering economically, and the people of Europe suffering from cold, from high prices, and from what looks increasingly like it could become an economic depression is increasing every time there's an act like this. And rather than moving towards peace, it's just day after day, escalation after escalation, and it's getting pretty scary. If you want further evidence that the United States are most likely to be involved in this, here is the island called Bornholm, which is under Danish control, and the two Nord Stream pipelines that go past that island And those yellow flash marks are where the damage was done through explosions to Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. Reports have come out today that there has been another explosion or another leak found in Nord Stream. So that's just adding to the damage done, irreparable damage. You may be able to stop the flow, but it's a whole other job to try to actually get flow moving back into these pipelines. I just show that map because we can see here that on the 21st of September 2022, around the time that this incident occurred, the US Navy had a government vessel 3 stationed in that very area and accompanying vessels that were with it as well. So that's further circumstantial evidence that the United States is heavily involved in what happened to the Nord Stream pipelines. Add to that the Seapower Staff report, which is a magazine for specialists underwater works, for marine works and things like that. And they were reporting back on the 14th of June that the NATO, and particularly being led by the United States Navy, was conducting operations and research right in that area. So in support of Baltop's, US Navy 6th Fleet partnered with US Navy research and warfare centers to bring the latest advancement in unmanned underwater vehicle mine hunting technology to the Baltic Sea to demonstrate the vehicle's effectiveness in operational scenarios. Experimentation was conducted off the coast of Bornholm in Denmark with participants from Naval Information Warfare Centre Pacific, Naval Undersea Warfare Centre Newport, and Mine Warfare Readiness and Effectiveness, measuring all under the direction of US 6th Fleet Task Force 68. So we can see that since at least prior to June, the US Navy has been operating in that area. And certainly they couldn't have missed if the Russians were there doing something. And I think it's pretty obvious because of motivation, because of the high level of circumstantial evidence, it's pretty obvious that the United States has done this. Not only does it take away Russia's principal, or one of Russia's principal bargaining chips, and also one of the lifelines that Europe has and the potential for Europe to get energy into the near future. There may be other reasons as well. CNBC has a headline out this week that the US and Europe are running out of weapons to send to Ukraine. And I'll just briefly talk about this. This story is saying that the United States has given so many howitzers, so many HIMARS, all this kind of stuff, not just the United States, but the UK and other countries, that they're actually running out of weapons to give. And there's this element of conflict happening in certain military infrastructures between those who feel that there has been enough given and that there actually will be a weakening of the capacity of the US Army and maybe the UK and other European armies if they continue to give weapons at this level. It also pointed out that it takes often 2 to 3 years to fulfill an order when weapons are ordered. So promises of weapons today may not really be seen for another 3 years unless they start depleting their own home supply of weapons. So that's all pretty interesting. Pork, have you any opinion on this escalation, on the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines, on what's happening?
Yeah, well, I mean, what's striking is if there's NATO vessels in and around that area, to think that there would be also Russian ones, it would be a huge risk of engagement. So like it's difficult to imagine that they're in close proximity to one another without there being a flashpoint. So if you can see evidence there that there is actually NATO vessels, it really does raise the question, doesn't it? Like I know all the media is pushing towards it being a Russian intervention with their own pipeline, but it does seem strange.
It does indeed. Moving on to your first story next, Pork, and it relates to the census in the north of Ireland. Do you want to maybe have a chat about that?
Yeah, so with everything that's gone on in world news, something as huge as this may not be given the type of attention that you would expect. So it is the first time since the foundation of the northern state that this has actually happened. And when you think about the creation of the northern state itself and how the census prior to the Anglo-Irish Treaty was actually leaned on to create the border itself. So the lines were drawn particularly to try and create that Protestant majority. Now, the thing that's striking now, we're 100 years on, and we're looking at it, and we're still talking in terms of religion, like, you know. So this really, it's very strange way to be looking at things at this stage. Surely the whole ideals of republicanism were all about secularism, given that republicanism itself was really launched in the 1700s by Presbyterians. So I mean, there is no adherence to religion in that ethos, and yet here we are, looking for binary statistics to push forward the border poll. So I just find it striking, and it's not something that is necessarily going to unify people.
Yeah, isn't there something really missing? And I think that's what you're inferring there, that communities are still divided, and a lot of the political language and the structures in the north of Ireland are almost designed in a way to maintain that sectarianism, to maintain that divide, and that talk of a border poll without doing the work to convince all of the people in the north of Ireland that some form of a unification of the Ireland will be of benefit to them. That work hasn't really been done yet, and there is a likelihood of this language of border poll, without that work really being done, that it could actually be more cause of friction than anything else. Would you go along with what I'm saying, or do you think I'm talking out my hat?
I would agree to the extent that this is probably the wrong way to be going about it. Like there was obviously moves towards the end of the 60s, the 1960s, where what had been the official movement had looked to try and create a working class solidarity across the communities, and that was the direction that they seen things going before the outbreak of the Troubles. But like what we had, in my view, towards the end, when the Good Friday Agreement was signed, was probably the end of a period where a lot of Northern nationalists were probably more identifiable as in the defenderist tradition than in the Republican tradition. Because if you're looking at it now, the Republican tradition doesn't really lean on the Good Friday Agreement for a path to unity. It doesn't see the unionist veto, I suppose, as something that should be aspired to try and get past purely on demographics. So, there's a lot to it there. I think it is striking that it has come to this point, where the numbers have caught up, but it's not conducive to bringing people together, that's for sure.
Yeah. And then lots of headlines, as we say, about the border poll over the last week, ramping up those discussions. What is Sinn Féin's take on it? Are you aware what their take is? Are they pushing for it, or do you think they're pushing for it in a kind of a watery old way?
Well, they are, Finbar. I mean, Sinn Féin's language on it for a good number of years now has all been talking about an agreed Ireland, and you can try and have a look and find out exactly what the definition of an agreed Ireland is. Like, they no longer talk in terms of a 32 county socialist republic. You don't hear that type of language anymore. It's very much much lighter language, and there's been all sorts of doors left open for even discussions in Commonwealth. So really, Sinn Féin, their position, take advantage of census figures. I think they've moved very far away from their foundation and what they were. So even in that context, you can see here there's an Irish Times article, which there's also, obviously, I would imagine, a bit of pushback. There is still a partitionist mindset in the 26 counties, which probably isn't totally enamored with unity in the short term. And then obviously with the unionist side and the loyalist side, they've absolutely no interest in it. Now, there is one interesting thing. This weekend there is an event in Dublin where there is discussions going on. I think civic nationalism has created it. There's a number of speakers, Sinn Féin are speaking on it, so maybe that's something we'll look in on next week and just see, was there anything remarkable on that?
Yeah, it might be interesting. I suppose another angle to take is that why would people in the north of Ireland want to join a republic that itself has given its sovereignty away and is not necessarily in many respects the most prolific and productive of countries for its people with regards to housing, cost of living, all those things as well. So maybe we in the Irish Republic have a lot of work to do if we are to get the people of the north of Ireland to aspire to want to join us. Another big story this week has been the protests in Iran. No, sorry, let me just go back there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I just okay. Consistently in the news over the last few months has been the inflation crisis, and in Germany, inflation has hit 10% over the September period. And in fact, it's worse in the Netherlands, where it's reached over 17%. And in countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, it's into the mid to higher 20% in terms of inflation. So these are very severe figures, and it doesn't look like anything's going to be curtailed. The predictions that are made time and again by economists representing governments are not coming true. Once again, it was predicted German inflation would drop. It hasn't dropped, and it looks like most European countries and the United States has now entered into recession. There have been protests all over Europe over the last week, but particularly in Germany. And many of those protests have been calling for the reopening of the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipeline. And that might be a bit of a link between that story and the story about the sabotage of those pipelines. Here's a protest from Plauen in Germany. Again, people are protesting the cost of living, but also protesting the continued expenditure on Ukraine and the closure of Nord Stream 1 and 2 gas pipelines. This is also a protest from Gera in Germany. Protest from Prague in Czechoslovakia.
Znamená, nejde jenom o budoucnost vlády, ale prostě o to, jakým způsobem vláda může přivést velkou část lidí ve společnosti zpět do společenské debaty, vlastně začít reflektovat.
And last week in Dublin City, there was a protest where up to 20,000 people attended. This is video footage courtesy of Mick Call. In the Irish protest, up to 20,000 people turned up. There was organizational participation from political parties and unions. It is promised to be the first of many growing protests in Ireland against the cost of living crisis. Pádraig, another story that you wanted to raise this week is the issue of homelessness, growing homelessness figures, and also an eviction of activists and homeless people in Parkgate House in Dublin.
Yeah, so the Sunday World carried a story this week, which was striking really, because of the huge number associated with it. So they ran with a housing crisis with official figures of 290,000 people classified with hidden homelessness at some point during the year. So like classically, like I suppose we think of homelessness, we're thinking of people on the street, but like there is this hidden homelessness that, you know, there's people and they're some of them are living with friends, some of them are living with family, but they don't have anywhere of their own. So that's taken into account, those type of people who find themselves in that position. There is an awful lot of trouble with students as well at the moment, which has been in the news, and I've picked up on a bit. In terms of people that are on the streets, the figure isn't 10,500 as you see there. There is a significant number of people rough sleeping, but this takes into account as well the Irish Examiner when they're calling out 10,568. That will take into account as well families living in hotels and different things. But it's an issue that hasn't really improved. And if you remember a few years back, there was an occupation of a building that was called Apollo House, and there was the great and good of Irish society, and there was actors and songwriters and all sorts of people came out, and they really did something to publicize the plight of people, and they took direct action, and there was great support for it, which probably culminated in, I can remember, an undertaking from Simon Coveney at the time, who was the minister, who made the claim, I think it was a good 5 or 6 years ago back now. He said that there would be no children living in hotels by Christmas. Obviously, that didn't come true. Like, so we still have this issue, and really, like the budget this week has made some references to trying to address these issues, but like it's very, very difficult to have any faith or belief in it now at this point, because how many budgets have we had since Apollo House?
It's a phenomenal figure, isn't it? 290,000 out of a population of just over 4.5 million, or maybe a bit more than that, but it's a phenomenal figure. I do know that if the EU definition of homelessness was considered, people living in caravans and things like that would also have to be considered, and the figure would be greater again. And as a percentage of our population, it's absolutely outrageous. Just moving on to advance the narrative on that story, Padraig, there was an eviction of activists and people without a home from Parkgate House in Dublin this week. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about that?
So in the context that there's 35,000 vacant homes in the country, there's an awful lot of vacant properties as well. It's come to a point where direct action has resurfaced. There is a group there now at the moment, the Revolutionary Housing League, who have taken the initiative to try and I suppose look after people that are rough sleeping and give them somewhere safe, somewhere warm to be, that's close. Like they've actually picked up a number of different sites in the city centre in the last few months. This is the third one that they've actually they've run as a centre for homeless people. They were fairly, you know, they were expecting it, I suppose. They were unceremoniously removed. There was some rough sleepers even arrested and brought to court there last week, which was shocking, really, because if you think about it, you know, you can easily engage with people, you can provide an alternative shelter, and you can do that by negotiation, but they chose to go the heavy-handed route, which was, you know, it's quite unpalatable when you're looking at it. Now, the property that they were evicted from the other day, it has a little bit of depth in it. The owner is Joe O'Reilly, who is a developer who also had an interest in speculative development on Moore Street. Now, the Revolutionary Housing League will be a group of Socialist Republicans, so there's a bit of a, I suppose, there's a theme to this. Like, it's the same guy who's also probably totally disrespected the Irish history, because the last stand of the leaders in 1916 on Moore Street. So it really shows you that we've got a real class issue when it comes to the speculator class. They haven't gone away since the banking crisis.
Before we go on this subject, Paul, I have a couple of video clips of the eviction that occurred the other night at Parkgate House. So we'll just have a look at that before we discuss it further.
You wouldn't like your own kids to be homeless. What, because you're getting thousands? Shame on you, you fucking prick.
Fair play to you, lads. Fair play to you, lads. First homeless person now. Done absolutely nothing wrong. Fair play to you, lads. Here to support. Fair play, guys.
So that was the arrest of activists and people without a home at Parkgate House during the week, and some witnesses who are clearly quite annoyed by those arrests. Paul, have we any update on those activists or the people without a home that were arrested what's happened to them? Or
yeah, so I don't know if you can pull back up the previous slide. They were all released without charge. Whether the state deems it to be counterproductive for them to take on people with an initiative like this in mind or not, we can only speculate. But they were released without charge, and I would presume that they will probably continue and seek another site. I just want to highlight as well, there are a large number of volunteer groups in the country. Just picking out a few there from the city centre in Dublin. You can see down the bottom here, we've got the Dublin Renters Union, which is actively working to try and keep people in their accommodation, fighting against high rents from landlords. 𝗟𝗁𝗲, which works around the north of the sea. It helps with food poverty. A Lending Hand is another crowd that are working around the city as well with food poverty. And there's others that are giving out clothes and sleeping bags, and these are all non-funded, totally volunteer groups, like aside from your NGOs and charities.
I know that it has been reported in the media over the last few months that there appears to be an attempt of a clampdown to a degree on groups like that are not under the control of some state agency. I'm not sure what the status of the groups working with homeless people are. That's what I'm referring to. But there has been a clampdown on groups that are not directly regulated by the state agency. So I know that the good work of good intentions of people is under pressure, not just in Dublin, but right across the country as well. We're under a bit of pressure here, Paul. So I'd just like to move on to the next international story, if you don't mind, which is the riots sorry, I'll just skip on there. The riots in Iran over the last week. And this is a Reuters headline. Iran protests over young woman's death continue. Human rights groups say that at least 83 people have been killed. So these are some protests that have broken out in Iran over the last week. And we were told by mainstream media, Western politicians, and a particular human rights group claiming to represent the women of Iran, and led by a woman that lives in the United States. We've been told that a woman called Armeni was brutally beaten to death by Iran's morality police for failing to wear a hijab, or in fact a scarf that Iran requires all women to wear, not across the face, but across the hair, and to hide one's hair. We were led to believe that these protests were erupting or were being led, they were spontaneous and initially, and were being led by the women of Iran who had enough of this hijab law. And I noted that there was one particular person who seemed to be spearheading the media campaign and also claiming to be a human rights activist herself in regards to this. Before we actually move on to the video I'm about to show you, in contrast to the narrative of that human rights organization and of mainstream media and Western politicians, Iran has come out to say that this lady, in fact, had a cardiac arrest. She was in a police station under arrest. She was not handcuffed. She was out in the waiting room. She developed chest pains. She asked somebody for help, and on camera, she dropped dead with a heart attack, or at least fell to the ground with a cardiac arrest. And here's the footage issued by the Iranian authorities as proof of that. So we can see over here, Armeni, she clutches a chair, she falls down. At no stage do I see the police beating her up. At no stage do I see her under attack. Here she has been taken away after having a cardiac arrest. And here's footage showing her being led to an ambulance. Now, the principal player in bringing the story to the West, as I said, is a self-identified leader of a humanitarian group or organization that claims to be based in Iran, but or report from Iran, but it actually has been based in the United States for the last 10 years. This particular person has initially, on the 14th of September, issued a tweet to the effect saying 22-year-old woman Masha Amini suffers heart attack after being arrested by morality police for wearing inappropriate hijab. Doctors say that it cannot save her life. So that was a tweet that was issued by 𝗟𝗁𝗍 𝗨𝗍, who is this US-based human rights activist, or self-styled human rights activist, that claims to report from Iran, but who has been living in the United States for the last 10 years. This is a picture of 𝗟𝗍 𝗨𝗍 with Mike Pompeo. And Mike Pompeo is without a doubt one of the most ardent regime change protagonists and advocates that has ever existed, I believe, in the United States government. So this is 𝗨𝗍 with Mike Pompeo. This is also from the USAspending.gov website, where you can search to find out who has received funding from the US government and the US State Department. And it would appear that 𝗟𝗍 𝗨𝗍 has received $628,050 from the United States government for her human rights work in Iran, even though she's not in Iran. Now, I'm not trying to say that the hijab, the rule around wearing headscarves in Iran, that's not what my commentary is about here. What it is about, it's about the timing of this, that Iran has been providing suicide drones to Russia to use in Ukraine, is a staunch ally of Russia, and has stood up by Russia in terms of the Ukraine conflict. And now there is internal strife that seems to be protagonized by human rights groups that are actually based and financed from the United States. And one of their main mouthpieces is this 𝗟𝗍 𝗨𝗍, who it appears to be an organ of the State Department. And when we look at the attack on Armenia, an ally of Russia, by Azerbaijan, and then the follow-up visit of Nancy Pelosi to Armenia, where she put up a threat to them a couple of weeks ago that either they abandon Russia or the United States will facilitate their neighbor to invade them and destroy them as a state. We also have trouble again being raised in the Kosovo-Serbian border, Serbia being an ally of Russia. And so we have this constant ramping up and development of what initially was a localized war in Ukraine into a wider global war. And I believe that the current protests in Iran are an instrument of US international energy policy and policy with regards to Ukraine. It doesn't take away from the rights of the women of Iran. In fact, I think this probably endangers their rights even more. Pork, do you have any opinion on this?
Timing is precarious, all right, Finbar. There is an awful lot of upheaval, and it seems to be in amongst regimes that are quite powerful and that have already established alliances. So yeah, look, I'm watching this space myself with interest, but obviously it's all unfolding.
Yeah. Pork, it's time to wrap up. We normally try to finish off with something that might make you giggle, something also that might be a bit cutesy. We have a video of Prince Charles, or at least a very comical voiceover of Prince Charles at his inauguration. We might have to watch this twice because I think it's very funny.
Fuck's sake, mate. Fucking bollocks this is. I shouldn't have to fucking do this shit, mate. I'm the king. What the fuck is this here? Can you just fucking move this out of the way? Fucking hell, mate. Being king is bollocks. I'm fucking done with this shit.
I think that's just gas. I think when you look at the lips closely, it's just, it's done absolutely perfectly. President Biden, it's kind of comical, but it's not. President Biden was giving advice on some of the most important things to do for those Americans facing hurricanes over the last week. This was his advice.
Let me be clear. If you're in a state where hurricanes often strike, like Florida or the Gulf Coast or into Texas, a vital part of preparing for hurricane season is to get vaccinated now. Everything is more complicated if you're not vaccinated and a hurricane or natural disaster hits.
So that's President Biden's advice. While the wind is blowing around you, while your house is being blown away, while the roof has been taken off, while your kids are down 4th Avenue, 500 feet into the air, his advice is check are you fully vaccinated. It's laughable, but it's also quite worrying, isn't it? What do you think about that, Paul?
It's insane. It's absolutely insane. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a product being created at the moment by Big Pharma to take care of hurricanes. I wouldn't be surprised.
Finally, something a little bit cutesy. We promised we'd finish off with something cutesy. Here's a dog on a motor.
He's chilling. He's chilling. Ah, look.
Okay, folks, thanks for tuning in. It's been a busy old show, as I say. If you like what we're doing, please like and share this video. Get it out there where you can. From Pork and myself, thanks for tuning in, and we'll speak to you again next week.